You might be sitting in the woods or running through the woods, but you can't sit or run your way away from the terrors of the forest. Today, I've got some allegedly true and scary camping and hiking stories that'll make you feel like little wingless bats are gnawing on your bones from the inside. A weird visual, sure, but it works. My friend MrBlackPasta will be helping out today, so do me a favor and support MrBlackPasta on his channel, The Disturbing Truth. He's covering intense true crime horror stories, so if that's your kind of thing, subscribe to The Disturbing Truth by clicking the link in the description. Be warned, the content will leave you unsettled, and it's not for the faint of heart. Check out this quick promo. If you've got a scary story to share, send it to me at darkstories.org so I can narrate it. I'm looking for stories about crawlers or security. Also, check out the newest episode of Freaky Folklore, as Carmen Carrion discusses the modern monster, the Smiling Man. Now, let's begin. Edge of the Lake, from LimboTheLost. I'm a 33-year-old female from Sweden, and I live in a very small town in the middle of nowhere. But there is at least a lot of very beautiful nature all around, and I love it. I have a favorite spot where I usually go camping at the least once a year nearby, at a beautiful lake pretty far into the woods. It's a popular spot for hikers and canoers, as there are several lakes connected by very little land, or sometimes streams just barely big enough to paddle through. It's a very beautiful place. I went camping there a bit late this year, as I've had and still have some back issues, so I hadn't been able to head out camping as much as I would have liked this summer. But I was determined to go out there and camp at least once this year, before it gets too cold. On September 4th, me and a friend of mine packed our things and headed to the lake. There were a surprising amount of people already there, and a surprising amount of families with kids. But in general, people willing to go this far out of their way to get here are always quite friendly. It was enjoyable, even if the kids were a bit noisy and they tripped over my tent twice. I made some food after setting up my tent right by the lake, enjoying the view, trying to take a dip, but holy crap, it was too cold. I only managed to get to the waist. I enjoyed the rest of the day just taking a nap and watching the lake, feeding some fish in the lake with some leftover pasta, just kind of enjoying nature. It was extremely relaxing, at least during the day. Once it started getting dark, me and my buddy started making a nice big campfire by a wind shelter that no one was using, as it was kind of starting to fall apart due to age. But as it was next to the tent, we figured we might as well use the fireplace already there, and some of the firewood people left for others to use. So we sat there, roasting marshmallows, lighting torches I brought with me just 'cause. Why not? And we watched the stars late into the night. Eventually, we did get tired, and decided it was time to go to sleep. Sleep was something I unfortunately failed to do, due to my buddy snoring very loudly. I was kind of just scrolling on Twitter, chatting with folks, trying to just get tired enough to doze off. But at about 4 a.m., still awake, still just trying to pass time, as by now I didn't expect to get any sleep at all. I was lying there in the tent, messing with my phone, when all of a sudden I heard a loud splash right outside the tent, followed by screams. They sounded like they came from a little girl. This screaming persisted for about a minute or two, before everything went dead quiet. As the initial shock of what I just heard settled in, I finally realized, oh shoot, what if that was one of the kids that got up to use the bathroom and fell in the lake? I grabbed my phone to use its flashlight. I went outside to try and see if I could see anything, but it was so pitch black outside that the measly little flashlight on the phone did nothing. I tried getting a look around, and I even tried to point the light into the water to see if anyone was out there. But again, it was just black. I couldn't see anything, and everything was still dead quiet. I was beginning to panic a bit, still thinking one of the kids might have fallen in and was now on the bottom, and I couldn't see them, meaning I couldn't do anything to help. I decided I'd go around to the other campers, telling them what happened, to see if everyone was accounted for. That meant I went around waking people up at 4 a.m., but after explaining what happened, they were surprisingly thankful over the fact that someone was looking out for them and making sure everyone was accounted for. As it turns out, everyone was in their tents and shelters, asleep, and no one else had heard the screaming but me. Not even my buddy had woken up from the screams, even if we were closest to the lake, and it happened right outside. After a while, checking on everyone and such, I really didn't know what to think, as no one was missing. Everyone had been fast asleep. Even the ones I woke up had fallen right back to sleep after that. I decided that I should probably just go back to the tent. So I did. But as I got close to my tent, I barely caught a glimpse of something big diving down under the water that had just been at the shore right in front of my tent. At this point, I decided I'd just go back into the tent and not come back out till dawn, no matter what. When I finally got back into the tent, my buddy had finally woke up, barely, and was asking me what I was doing. I explained everything so far to her, and just as I finished explaining what happened, we both heard something big beginning to pace around our tent. It kept pacing for quite a while, only once going over to the empty wind shelter, pacing around in there for a bit. Its footsteps did not sound like human steps. They were too heavy and sounded more like hooves or something similar as I listened to it clomping around on the wooden floor of the shelter before it came back over to the tent, pacing around our tent again. I wasn't about to go back out to see what it was at that point. We just lay there in silence, waiting for dawn. Once the sun began to come back up, the pacing just kind of stopped. We didn't hear anything walk away, so we just kind of stayed in the tent until we could hear the other campers beginning to wake up. At that point, it did feel safe to actually get out of the tent again. Chatting with the other campers, they hadn't heard anything, and most of them had slept through the night without any issue, with the exception of me waking up some of them to ask if everyone was okay. And again, they were actually thankful that I'd gone out of my way to check on them, even if we were all strangers. It had made them feel safe that someone had been looking out for them. But since it was none of the other campers, that leaves the question of what was in the water. What screamed? And what was pacing around outside the tent until dawn? What a creepy night. Feels like I experienced a horror movie plot in real life. And yet, I do want to get back out there again next summer. But this time, I'll set up camp a bit further away from the water.
Bigfoot Chased Me, from MadameVenome. Back in 1999, when I was 12, I liked to explore the woods across the street from my home in rural Virginia. We lived in an area that was populated, but people didn't live on top of what we call the mountain. To be honest, it wasn't really a mountain, but we were in the foothills, and these so-called mountains were higher than any other surrounding land. I would take my dogs, a golden retriever Saint Bernard, and my beagle mix. The neighbor's friendly little mixed breed would come too, and we would go through the culvert below the road and follow the creek up to a pond at the base of the mountain. We stayed gone all day, and it was nice to not have anyone around to spoil my fun. I mostly walked and played in the creek, but sometimes I climbed up in an old deer stand to look out across the creek. It was always peaceful and serene. Sometimes I would spot deer grazing and drinking, or even rabbits and squirrels playing. One time I saw a bear. I just stayed quiet, and eventually it meandered away. I had to admit this was a great hiding spot and playground. I liked spending long days just watching nature and not listening to my dad and his friends get drunk. I spent so much time there that I got used to the surrounding noises and smells. After a while, very little ever surprised me. That fall, puberty hit, and my body changed. I wasn't happy about it, and I spent a lot of time outside trying to avoid thinking about it. The changes made me closer to being an adult, and that thought was not great. This will be important later. I should mention here that the pond itself was at the base of the mountain, and it was surrounded by trees. Mostly pine trees, if my memory serves me well. They were part of a tobacco farm, and a small dirt track led between another clump of trees and the ones that surrounded the pond. The closest houses were on each side of the forest, and of course, mine was across the street. The woods could be spooky sometimes, but at the time it was just mind over matter. The creek that ran down from the pond went under the trees and back in the direction of my house, and that was how I traveled back and forth. The creek that fed the pond was a mystery to me. I had never followed it very far because it led back into the mountain, and sometimes there were no paths to lead me back. One day I decided to follow the creek up and see what the source of the pond was. It disappeared into the ground a few times only to re-emerge again. I was enjoying myself because I guess I fancied myself a little amateur explorer, and my dogs trailed behind me sniffing and playing. It was unusually quiet that day, but it was cloudy and cool, so I thought all of the animals must have been hunkered down somewhere warm. I came to a place where the creek suddenly twisted around a bend of rocks and disappeared into the ground again. I looked around for the creek and saw a trickle coming out of the ground ahead of me. I walked to where it was, anticipating the newness of the find, and that's when I got an eerie feeling. It was as if I could feel someone or something watching me. Now, I don't mean to sound like a Disney princess, but the animals were used to my smell and they didn't go out of their way to avoid me. As a matter of fact, wild animals in those woods sometimes followed me or had a tendency to get a little too close for comfort. This didn't feel like that, not at all. I smelled this horrible stench, and honestly, it was worse than any animal corpse I had ever smelled before or since then, for that matter. I nearly gagged. I was about to round the corner entirely to find the source of the smell when all three dogs came barreling towards me with their hackles raised and their teeth bared. And their teeth bared. That got my attention. The dogs began frantically herding me towards the pond, and when I went for the creek, they chased me over towards the dirt road. I knew that there were trees across it, but I would be at the main road within 5 minutes as opposed to the 10 it would take to follow the creek carefully. I hurried with the stench right behind me. I was 1,000% positive that this was not a skunk and not something I wanted to see. I kept going, terrified that the source of the smell was going to show up. My dogs pushed me forward and stayed behind me, growling and snapping. I began to slow my pace as I got to the main road, panting and huffing. I noticed my leg was wet. I looked down to see that I had bled through my jeans. Embarrassed and tired, I crossed the road and went inside. The next time I was at my dad's, I stayed away from the woods, but the following weekend I went back in and it was all quiet. It stayed like this for a long time until spring, and that's when it happened again. This time was a close call because I was in the tree stand when I heard loud crunching steps. I smelled that same smell and made for the road the same way with the same 3 dogs, losing their ever-loving mind. This repeated itself every month. Not long after this, my dad and stepmom split up and I no longer had access to those woods. I grew up and moved on, but I never understood what was going on until I watched a special on Sasquatch. The show described how women were sometimes herded by what Native Americans described as Sasquatch. When I put it all together, I wondered if puberty had somehow alerted the thing to me, not to mention my bright red hair. I'll never know for sure, but every time I look at the mountain, which is nearly every day because I live in its shadow, I remember that something chased me and it smelled awful. It sent my dogs into a panic.
Stalking a Satanist. From Anonymous. I like to go hiking and camping often. I've always liked the outdoors, and I take any chance I get to get out into the wilderness. My friend and I had planned to hike for 3 days into the mountains and 3 days out, a 6-day trip total. Day 1 was very normal. My friend and I started at the bottom of a valley, and we planned to camp at the top of the mountain before us. We made it to the top at about 8 p.m., and we prepared for the night. I gathered firewood, and my buddy cleared out the area where we'd be pitching our tents. It was mostly quiet until around 10 p.m. A few elk cries came from the forest. This didn't bother us because on trips we've taken before, we've heard these cries. After about 15 or 20 minutes of these cries, which were about 5 to 15 seconds apart each, we heard a horrible screeching sound. We both figured this scream was the scream of a cougar. After the cougar screamed for 7-ish seconds, it was silent again. The entire forest was quiet. This was kind of weird, but not worthy of losing sleep over. The both of us slept like rocks that night. In the morning, we ate and packed up, beginning farther into the country. After walking for about 2 hours, we came across the most bizarre and terrifying sight. Some sort of gantry was hanging from the trees. The heads of elk were strung up, hanging around the head of a cougar. This gave a whole new meaning to the sounds we heard that night. We decided to hike a few kilometers east of that location, then continue north. When we stopped for lunch, we saw a dark mass on a hill in front of us. It looked human, but they were dressed in dark, cloak-like garments. It's important to know that where we were hiking, it's not a designated area for hiking or camping, so there's no reason for someone without proper equipment to be all the way out here. We wondered if this was the person responsible for the elk and cougar gantry from earlier. We decided to pack up fast and follow them. Neither of us were hunters or trackers, but we watched enough YouTube and movies to get the right kind of idea. We made up about 2 kilometers and could see them in front of us. We were now on the back side of the hill we saw them on earlier. They were sitting on a log with what looked to be a knife in their hand. We ducked behind cover to observe them. They were sitting so still that it was weird. After about 45 minutes of just sitting motionless, a deer walked right in front of them. Then, out of nowhere, the cloaked figure jumped on the deer, stabbing its neck and killing it. They pulled out some string or wire and began to hang the deer from the tree. Wanting to give them the benefit of the doubt, we assumed that it was some sort of old native hunting technique. Then the figure went back to sitting still. We continued to observe from cover. After about 3 hours, a man came from the northern side of them and the deer. Soon after that, a few more people came from the same direction. They began to make marks in the ground, starting to chant. By this point, we were both terrified. All the people except for the first original cloaked one stabbed themselves. We knew for certain then that there was something truly wrong happening. I pulled out my satellite phone to call the police or Fish and Game warden, anyone that could help. I explained everything that happened to the police while my friend continued to watch. The police tracked my phone and said help was on the way but would not be there for a few hours. It was then we saw the original cloaked figure, the last remaining one now, beginning to eat the ones who had offed themselves. We left right then and there. We must have made too much noise getting up, because we heard that figure scream some curse at us and begin to walk towards us. By then, it was probably 1 kilometer away from us, so we just kept booking it. After another minute or so of sprinting, and about half an hour of jogging, then 2 more hours of walking, we were at a vantage point, and we looked back. There was a torchlight about 2 to 2.5 kilometers behind us. It must have decided not to run after us. After all, we had a head start to begin with. A few more minutes of jogging later, we heard a plane. Quickly, we pulled out mirrors and began to reflect light at them to try to signal the plane. They saw us. It circled us, and then a few minutes later, a helicopter came to us. The distant torchlight stayed still for the whole time the plane was circling us and during the helicopter's landing. Then the torch started to cower and turned back towards the ritual site. The helicopter landed and picked us up. They tried to track the figure, but somehow lost them. They did find the dead bodies and began an investigation. Statements were taken. Because someone else had witnessed the torchlight, the law enforcement did believe our story, at least somewhat. All in all, my buddy and I were safe and down $5,000 each for the helicopter evac. I would much rather be out $5,000 than be killed for some ritual. To this day, I believe they were some kind of Satanist, upset that we had witnessed their ritual.
Antlers in the Woods, from Anonymous. I was 17 when this happened. My family and I live in the woods of Colorado. I was going on a hunting trip with my dad. I always loved hunting with my old man, but this experience scared me out of the woods for a while. We were heading to our hunting spot. We even brought along some camping gear to spend the night. When we got there, we unpacked our stuff and set up camp. When that was done, we started to hike down the trail and were hoping to hunt a buck or an elk, and that'd be pretty awesome. Anyway, while we were walking, we heard some howls from wolves and coyotes, but we weren't worried about them. We were worried about encountering a grizzly bear, but if we did, we'd have just fired off a warning shot. When my dad and I reached the top of the mountain, we gave out some calls to try and attract something. A few minutes of waiting later, we heard elk, but they were only females, no males yet. We continued down the trail calling out, but then my dad stopped me. We saw antlers on a tree stump. My dad thought that another hunter must have been there before us, but In my mind, I was thinking, what kind of hunter leaves antlers behind after he's made a successful hunt? Whatever the case was, we continued walking, and as we did, we kept seeing more and more antlers, both deer and elk. I told my dad we should head back to camp, and he agreed. As we made our way back to camp, I started to feel like something was watching us, but I looked around and there was nothing. A few moments later, we saw a male elk. We both hunkered down and I raised my rifle. I took a deep breath and then pulled the trigger. It was a direct hit right in the heart. When we got to it, it was already dead. So we went through the process of, well, you know. Then we made it back to camp and started to cook dinner. When my dad finished preparing our meals, we sat down and started talking about old memories while enjoying the sounds of nature. After a while, I brought up those antlers we saw earlier. My dad said he doesn't know why anyone would leave antlers behind. Then suddenly we heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the woods. We didn't see who or what was making the noise clearly, but I did see antlers. But the weird thing was they were 8 feet off the ground and I could make out glowing eyes. My dad looked in that direction and froze. Suddenly the creature came out of the brushes and we saw its true form. It was like no animal I'd ever seen. Its skin was gray and almost rotten, like bone being covered by skin. It had long arms with very sharp claws and a head that looked like the skull of a wolf with pointy human-like teeth. It roared at us, and my dad and I grabbed our guns. We immediately started shooting at it. It screeched in pain and charged at us. We made a run for it into the woods. As we were running, we could hear that the thing was right behind us. We kept going, and then hid behind some large rocks. We stayed as quiet as we could, just hoping the thing didn't have a good sense of smell. Then we heard it run by us. We waited for a minute, then decided to run back to camp. When we got there, we packed up everything as fast as we could and quickly left the area. We made it home before it got dark, and we ran inside. My mom saw us and asked what happened. My dad lied and said we encountered an aggressive grizzly bear. Later that night, we went to sleep. I was still shocked about what happened, and I just couldn't get my eyes to stay shut. Nothing else ever happened, and we never encountered that thing again. But I firmly believe that what my father and I saw was a Wendigo.
Possible Skinwalker from Kaitlyn S. This sighting happened on 2 occasions. The first incident happened about a month ago. I live in Georgia, and it's a quiet town. I was looking for a hiking trail for me and my boyfriend to go on. I'd found an area on a road called Morgan Road. This trail is kind of sketchy, but it is in the rural part of town. The trail itself is nice and pretty, but once I got out of the car, I felt like something didn't want me there at all. I was paranoid, looking around and listening. Still, the hike was okay, besides the major feeling of being watched. I saw the end of the trail eventually, and I was so happy. But then, I heard it. A loud rustle to my left. I saw something big. I ran as fast as I could to get out of there. My boyfriend was confused, and later he told me that he did see something big. Bigger than the white-tailed deer we have around here. That's the end of the first encounter. The second one was more recent. This happened yesterday. We decided to go back to the same trail. Once again, when I got out of the car, I felt as if something didn't want me there. The feeling was ominous, and I felt like I was about to get jumped by something. Then I heard it, some sort of screaming. My boyfriend said it could be a rooster, but I know what a rooster sounds like, and this wasn't one. This was more like a human screaming, but it wasn't that either. It was off in the distance, but then it seemed to get more in front of us, but somehow still far away. We decided to keep on walking. Soon I began to hear rustling close to my left. It might have been a squirrel, but that feeling of something full of hate being out there with us was still present. My heart pounding and my blood running cold, I said, "We should go back." And my boyfriend agreed. We did a light jog back to the car. It took us a while to calm down. I told my boyfriend about the feeling I had, and he said he'd had the same feeling. We then made an agreement to never go back to that trail again.